Hello and welcome from the psychology of almost everything. I'm delighted to say that this episode we're going to continue about the psychology of policing, and again we have Clive with us.
Hi, it's good to be back.
Clive, I'm going to kick off with the first question. Just to remind the listeners, when we last spoke, you were telling us about your career and how you joined the CID. Perhaps you can pick it up from there.
So I did 10 years on that city centre division, 6 of which were as a young detective about town. And then I made the decision to get promoted. Made that decision myself. Didn't need a push and got promoted to sergeant. Went back into uniform for a very short time and within months went back out to the CID as a detective sergeant.
Sorry to interrupt, Clive. Is that something you have to do when you get promoted?
It is, Stewart. Yes, it is. It's to give you exposure to organisational changes in a wider field.
So hang on a minute. You go back into uniform. Were you not back on the beat again doing what you did before?
No. Maybe supervising beat officers, but also lots of other, not administrative, but supervisory responsibilities, overseeing operational planning, that kind of thing.
When you say you went for promotion, presumably you have to pass an exam?
Written exam, assessment centres, spoken interview panels.
You have to know about the law?
It's more about organisational structure, direction of travel, change in social trends, external relationships with other organisations, like the prosecuting authorities, to equip you to be able to reach out better.
So you pass your exams, you go back in uniform for a while, then you get back into plainclothes?
Absolutely, yeah. Invited by a senior detective that I'd worked for some time and go out to one of the suburban areas. And that was interesting. That was challenging because the area I'm talking about was like a 1960s new build estate, a bit like on the Milton Keynes model. And in that sense, it was ring fenced. And what was very different about it was working in a city centre where the population is transient. The city centre's empty at night. The population comes in during the day, stays for a bit, goes to work, goes home. Working in this suburban area, nobody went out of the ring fence around that particular estate. So in fact, all the crime that's being committed, you can be 98% sure it's been committed by somebody who lives within a couple of miles of the police station.
Of the people, by the people, for the people.
Absolutely. Yes, yeah. Often referred to as the People's Republic of. So that was a different experience for me. But over time, it actually became limiting because it was just about dealing with local, low-level crime. There was no industry in this area. There was no real commerce. It was basically domestic disputes, neighbour disputes that turned to violence, low-level burglary, car theft.
So you keep arresting the same people in a way?
That too. And actually that gave me my first real exposure to the notion that if you get into the argument between nature and nurture, I will always fall down on the nurture side because I've seen the family environments that these repeat offenders come from. And they come from families that have got criminal history and where it's the family culture. They've known nothing else as they've grown up as kids and young adults.
That's very interesting.
That persuaded me that nurture is what it's about.
Sure.
Social conditions.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the influence that your parents and your siblings and your friends, your friendship group, all of those things. But it became limiting over time. So then, 15 years in, I went on the drug squad, which was my first specialist role, and I was there for about 5 years, and that truly was an eye-opener. It was there, and I've mentioned this to you before, Peter, that that was where I learned you've got to be Cerberus, the two-headed dog. You've got to be looking at what's going on in front of you, and you've got to be constantly vigilant about what's going on behind you.
Tell us more. Give us an example.
Well, the drug squad is the drug world is its own commercial world with its own language, its own behaviours, its own level of sophistication in terms of criminality. You really do have to plan and think ahead and anticipate in that world. Because, of course, you're not investigating crimes that have happened. You're trying to anticipate when a crime is going to happen so that you can be there on the spot to make the seizure and catch the people with the gear in their hands.
Presumably for that you need informers. Somebody in on the deal who's going to tip you off.
Peter, absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. And it's interesting you say that because informers I've always reflected on the use of informants in the police. Of course, it's valuable. It's essential. It can make or break an operation if you've got a good informant who's close in and he's being properly handled and the intelligence is being assessed properly. They can take you in through the front door at the right time. I was always amazed at the individuals I worked with, of whom there weren't many, that could handle informants. And I would be the first to say that I couldn't. And I know why I couldn't. Because I always thought of informants, and still do, essentially as traitors. They're a traitor in your midst. And some of the detectives I worked with, they could have a totally unemotional relationship with an informant, where the informant falls in love with them and feels secure in their company and would share anything with them. When I tried to run informants, they would very quickly sense that I thought they were traitors. I communicated it either through body odour or through the words I was using.
Oh, people would pick it up at a...
Peter, absolutely. A sixth sense.
Yes.
And I have to say that was in my armoury, that was one of my great weaknesses. I was never able to do that. But of course I always had the benefit of guys and girls working for me who were very good at that.
So at this stage, by definition, you are managing a team and something. Say working for me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Could you give us an idea of how many in the team?
6, 8, 10. Kind of a core of 6 or 8. But then, of course, once you start an operation, as I said, it's all about planning. So a lot of the work we did was surveillance. We would look at a team operating for months and build up surveillance patterns. People think about surveillance, well, it's getting in your car and following people about. It isn't. It's much more subtle than that, because eventually you're going to get blown out. When you're looking at a team and you know their behaviours and their favourite locations and their meeting points and their mistresses and the addresses they go to, when you know all of that, why would you do anything to make them change behaviour? Because you've got to start again. So your surveillance is very selective. So you might start with low-level surveillance and just develop a life pattern. So on a Monday he goes to the gym. He goes to the gym on a Friday again. On Thursday he goes to see his mistress. On Wednesday he picks the little one up from school. You build this pattern up. Well, that means you don't have to follow him. On those occasions you know he's going to be at the gym. There's no point following him. So you build up this pattern over a period of time so that you get to develop a percentage picture of knowledge where kind of for 60% of the week, you know where the individual is going to be anyway. And you only need to engage in surveillance when your intelligence is beginning to tell you that things are coming together. Like the gear's arriving, or he's going to go to Liverpool to do this, or what. Those changes, that's what you surveil. So you were talking about the team, Peter. Surveillance is labour, it's resource intensive. It was always a minimum 6 cars, 2 motorcyclists, 2 people in each vehicle.
This is where there's a huge gap between what the television programmes show us and the reality, isn't it? Because usually on the television programmes, the same team does surveillance, does the cyber security, does everything.
And with the headlights on.
It's also, perhaps on a more serious note, whenever now there's a terrorist attack and it becomes known that the terrorist was known to the authorities, it's always like, well, why weren't we keeping a tab on him? But you would need thousands of people, wouldn't you, to keep a tab on all the known... all the possible suspects, as it were.
Stuart, it's resource impossible.
Yeah.
And also, we all live in a democracy. In many cases, it's disproportionate.
Yeah.
You may have intelligence about somebody that they kind of think they'd like to be a terrorist and they've got some deeply unpleasant political views. But actually, they're not the kind of person that's ever going to do anything.
Sure.
Well, you're not going to deploy resources there.
Let's go back to the drugs for a while, because one of the things that's always fascinated me would be, as you were saying, you have to look forward and you have to look back. Presumably there's a question in your mind all the time, particularly as a manager, about corruption.
Yeah.
Whether anybody in your team is in on the take. I mean, can you...
Peter, yes, and that's what, when I talk about the 2-headed dog looking behind. So, I fell victim to working with some corrupt officers. At the time it cost me dearly, but I look back on it with humour now and I can see what was going on. Look, there's a lot of money in the drugs world. Tax-free money, cash, liquid. There's a lot to attract individuals that want to have access to that money. So there were times when I found myself working with individuals, not many, who were corrupt, who were stealing, who were recycling drugs, who were in relationships with drug dealers that were of mutual benefit to everybody. And these people are selling out their colleagues. And I've shared with you before, I've been arrested a couple of times at least, but actually I was arrested more as collateral, because whilst I'm looking forward trying to plan and deal with the people I need to be dealing with and developing operations and intelligence, behind me there are people who are just feathering their own nest, who are actually in bed with the villains, not necessarily the ones I'm looking at, and they're doing it for nothing more than financial gain.
I'm mindful of what you said in the first podcast, which was that the salary for policemen isn't particularly good when you start out, so presumably that is part of what's going on here, as you say.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it
the
is.
Sense of, I need more.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's Peter. I use the word greed. Greed is a powerful motivator. Okay, the salary was never great. You don't necessarily join the police for the salary, but it was enough to live on if you lived a modest lifestyle. But some of these guys and girls, they want more, and they're attracted by the tax-free, to use,
yes,
and the easy money. But look, we all know as a driver in all kinds of crime, easy money is one of the big motivators. So yeah, I find myself arrested because behind me individuals have been in deeply sinister relationships, and they've been investigated by the in-house
anti-corruption.
Yeah, absolutely. They all exist. All forces have them, and they have to. And there comes a point where they have to make a strike, so people end up getting arrested. And if you're part of the fallout around the edge of that, then you're going to get arrested as well. And that's what happened to me.
Which is really interesting when we think about the kind of person going into the profession. Mm-hmm. We've talked about, in your case, it was the passion for football and your height and so on and so forth. But you'd also have to be very resilient to deal with that, because you would imagine some people, if they've been arrested when they're trying to do the right thing, they surely would be tempted to throw all their toys out of the pram and not be a policeman anymore.
No, Peter, resilience is right. You do have to be incredibly resilient. But I will say this for me, although somebody's put their hand on my shoulder and said, Clive, we need to have a chat. Coming with us. Yeah, okay. I know that I've done nothing wrong. And that is a powerful emotion. And I know that I have always been very professional in terms of my record keeping. I can account for every move I've made. And very often, if you're able to do that, if you can account for everything that you've done and it's right and proper and true, that actually contributes to the picture of what's been going on behind you. So it not only exculpates you as an individual, it actually contributes to resolving what's been going on behind you.
I was just thinking about the people behind you who weren't playing by the rules. Greed is obviously a huge driver, as you say, but it must be very irksome to be in that position where you're just making a living and you're living by the rules, and you're watching criminals who are clearly flaunting the rules, having these lavish lifestyles. You can see how that's so tempting, isn't it, for people to break the rules?
It is.
If it's easy for them to break the rules, I think they're going to get away with it.
Stuart, you're right. Resentment or envy, never experienced that emotion, because part of my motivation was always these people are seriously damaging society. Uh-huh. Never mind the tax breaks and all of that trivial, all of that superficial nonsense. These people are damaging society. And remember, it's not just the drug distribution network. It's the physical violence. It's the fear that they introduce into communities. It's really toxic and corrosive. It's not just about the drugs. I never had any notion of envy or even admiration of any kind that these.
Some of your colleagues did, though, didn't they? By the sound of it.
Absolutely, yeah. Absolutely. Not many, but
that's good to hear.
Could we move then from drugs? What was your next posting, as it were? Go to murder, is that right?
No, promoted again.
Promoted. Another assessment centre?
The whole thing. Yeah, the written exam, the assessment centre, the short-term exposure to what's going on in the...
Back in uniform again?
Yeah, for a short time, yeah. And then, approached by, again, a senior detective I'd worked with. We've got a couple of slots coming up on the murder unit. Do you fancy it? Yeah, absolutely. So by then, I'd got about 23 years servicing, and so on the basis I was going to do 30. My last 7 were on the murder squad. Although it was commonly known within the organisation, for political reasons, we were actually known as the MIU, and M does not stand for murder. It stands for Major Investigation Unit. The reason for that is that murder is just a bit evocative and a bit exclusive. It kind of shuts us down to just one area of operation. The reality is that's all we did. That's all we actually did, was investigate murders. But the notion of a major investigation unit, we all remember the Yorkshire Ripper. I think we're all familiar with the failings in that investigation. They're acknowledged. One of the major failings was the sheer volume of information that generated. It was unmanageable. That they had whole libraries of information that they didn't even know they had. It went on for so long, and there was so much work done, and there was a geographic spread. It was impossible to manage that investigation. But now we have computers. That makes it a lot easier. So, of course, with the advent of computers in the 90s and then the early 2000s, systems were developed. So all those major investigations that are going to generate a tremendous amount of activity and information, they've got to be held on a system archive. So that's why we were actually known as the Major Investigation Unit, because we would do any investigation that required massive management of information.
What was your success rate then in the Major Investigation Unit?
While I was there, we only did murders, because, hey, that's the reality of it. Mm-hmm. For me, 95% plus. I had a couple that I didn't clear, but in fact, I inherited those. They were investigations that had been started, had not really gained traction, hadn't really developed even a notion of what this was about. And so 6 months in, maybe just a change of leadership, a fresh set of eyes, nothing more than that, no criticism implied, because that sometimes happens. 2, I can remember, that I didn't succeed, both like that. One was a heroin dealer out in the West Midlands, and he lived in a ground floor masonette, this guy, and his body was found one morning, face down on the living room carpet with the television on, with a single bullet in the back of his head. The forensic sweep of the house revealed absolutely nothing, no foreign body or matter. The only stuff in the house was his DNA on the cutlery and the stuff, his fingerprints, he presented as though a ghost had walked into the house, shot him in the back of the head and floated out of the house without touching it. That was all we'd got. And he was a deeply disliked individual, so there was no community support. There was no will in the community to contribute to solving it. And unfortunately, I mean, there are lots of murders like that go unsolved in that way.
Is it right that most murders, though, are men killing their partners after, their wives or partners after a domestic row, and quite often on Saturday night with alcohol involved?
Stewart, I don't know the numbers, but it is just by logic right, because that is look. It is often said the greatest number of women that die at the hands of their partners. So there's one of the statistical steers. We never dealt with any of that. That's dealt with by the local police because it's reasonably straightforward. Right. I don't mean to trivialise it by that.
No.
It's serious, but from an investigation point of view. Yeah. So to come back to, the Major Investigation Unit, we only investigated murders that were going to generate a lot of work.
Right.
And in fact, murders are categorised. They're categorised as A, B and C. So C tends to be your domestic murders, or maybe a stabbing in a pub where everybody in the pub says, yeah, well, Johnny Smith did it because he fell out with his brother. And so you've got a load of witnesses, you've got everything you need, you go out and find Johnny Smith. That's category C. That's not going to generate a lot of work. And the local police in teams will deal with that. Category B is essentially where you've got a victim. You may not know who the victim is when a body's first found, never mind who the offender is. And so the whole investigation is going to generate a lot of work. So that's a category B. So we used to get category B murders. Category A is the same, but it's a murder that's likely to generate significant public and media interest. And therefore it needs all the extra resources that go with managing that, putting into it.
So would you recruit a team then to help you, like from psychologists or forensic analysts? Or
Yeah, all of those, Peter, yeah. And even
for a particular case.
For a particular case, and even the team of detectives. Although we had our own core of detectives full-time, us, of course we would have to have that because they were familiar with the IT system. They were familiar with our processes. That would be our core, but then we would enhance that with bigger numbers. We'd make an estimate of kind of how many detectives do I need, and the local area where the murder happened, they have to provide.
And over what sort of
those
period
extra
of
people.
time would these cases take? I imagine it's very variable, but what's the shortest time you would need to sort out a case?
Well, sort out is the variable there, Peter, because although you might identify an offender within a few days, if things go well, you might not find them for 9 months. Or indeed, if it's a particularly complex murder, you've got to prepare the prosecution case. There are a tremendous number of variables in there. Again, we go back to the television. You know, on the TV, when the forensic scientist turns up and finds a fingerprint, and then like 2 minutes later, they know who it is. It doesn't quite. It doesn't quite work like that. These things take time. They come and do their forensic examination, and you won't get the results for sometimes weeks, sometimes months. So there are so many variables. If you said to me, what's an average? Peter, my average was 6 to 8 months. But that's from, forgive the expression, cradle to grave. You know, that's like from discovering the event, being appointed as the SIO, the Senior Investigating Officer, gathering your team around you, identifying the offender, launching the prosecution.
And going to trial?
Yeah, because...
So to get the conviction?
Absolutely, Peter, because, of course, the defence will often... The evidence will tell you that the individual has done it. But the defence will often run their defence on the basis of abuse of process or looking for chinks in. I mean, you have to close off. It's not just about identifying who's done it. You have to close off every other avenue of possibility, because otherwise the defence will open it up and they'll say, yeah, but did you ever consider this? You know, my guy says he hasn't done it. Did you consider this? Because this is a possibility. And that's enough.
On the whole, will most people confess once you've apprehended them?
Absolutely not.
Oh, right, okay.
No.
Right.
No, 1 or 2 do, but that's a rarity. That's a rarity. No. So most Category A, Category B murders are criminals operating in the criminal underworld, eliminating other criminals. So they're not the kind of people that just readily roll over and say, guys, it's been really nice knowing you, but I'm happy to go to prison for the rest of my life.
Right.
They're not those kind of people. So no, all of my murders, apart from one, went to trial. All of my murders went to trial.
And you got convictions in?
All of them. Yeah. So a couple that I didn't succeed with, but I inherited those. They were already kind of, nothing's unsolvable, but all the opportunities that might have existed to solve them had long gone.
So they didn't even get to trial?
No, never identified the offenders, but they remain unsolved and on the books to these days.
I take it the Yorkshire Ripper, maybe you didn't have that categorisation then, but that would be a Category A. Murder.
Absolutely, yeah. And they didn't,
Right.
Stuart, no, and they didn't.
Clive, we're coming to the end of our time. And I was just thinking about all the skills you need and what you've learned over the years. And I was wondering if you'd like to sort of summarise, when you left the force, what were your reflections on it?
The day I finished, as I got dressed to go to work, knowing that my team were going to take me out for lunch, I looked in the mirror and I said to myself, wow, you got away with it? And that doesn't imply anything sinister. It was because I reflected on some of the seriously difficult times that my resilience had seen me through. Great times, most of them, worked with great people. But we've already, we've used the word resilience. That is the big one. But isn't that true in kind of most walks of life, that you need resilience?
Well, I was mindful listening to you talk about murders. I mean, there you're talking about matters of life and death, and you're talking about working in a world where there's some pretty nasty people who wouldn't think twice about murdering you.
No, okay.
Some insurance company.
No.
A different...
And actually the resilience I refer to is actually against harm inflicted on me by my own organisation. And not intentional, sometimes because of organisational failures, sometimes because of want of resources, sometimes you want to do something and they don't give you the equipment you need to do it. So, but we all have those disappointments. Enormous pride at my achievements. I don't like the word satisfaction, but to go back to the notion of challenge, I can look back and think of many families of victims and victims themselves, of course not murder victims, but victims themselves, that I've actually helped through a very difficult time in their life, and they've come through it out the other end. So when I finished, I reflected on all of the positives. I've worked with other guys who, unfortunately, when they finish, they reflect on the negatives. and they carry that with them for the rest of their lives. I never had to say that to myself. When I finished, the positives were the greater part of my picture, looking back.
That's a great point to finish.
That's all wonderful. Clive,
Yeah.
thank you so much for your time.
I've got one quick joke for you, Clive.
Okay. Am I in it or not?
No, I'm afraid not. No. Well, I know.
I don't want to be.
No, but I can make you be in it. You probably remember this case, Clive, when you were on the drug squad and you were walking down the street and you saw that hippie there and he was so stoned, wasn't he? And you went up to him and you collared him and you said, "Listen, son, I'm going to have to give you a drugs test." And he said, "Great, man. Which drugs are we testing?" Thank you, Clive. That's been wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Clive.
Thanks for your time. It's been great fun.